Hello there, Flip here, and today, as promised, we are going to be covering the halter sibling Lynette. In a pre-release guide who was shown off in the livestream, we will be giving an overview of Lynette's kit as well as covering her most important constellations, best weapons, artifacts, and teams. But before that, as always, if at any point during the video you're entertained or informed, make sure to drop a like and even consider subscribing, as I will be dropping a ton of guides leading up to Fontaine and I can assure you that you don't want to miss any. Lynette is a 4-star Anemo sword user who's primarily going to be used as an off-field Anemo damage dealer. Her normal attacks are just normal attacks, there's nothing much to say. And with her elemental skill, it has both the tap and hold variant. With the tap variant, you just do an instance of Anemo damage, and with the hold variant, you do something similar to a Yolani, where you enter the Pilfering Shadow state, and you get to apply a shadow sign. What edgelord came up with these names? You basically just mark one nearby enemy and it will deal damage to them when you exit the state. And at certain intervals when Lynette thrusts, this will do Osea aligned Anemo damage, which is the new Fontaine mechanic that will be useful for some enemies. Before I forget, when using her skill, you will regenerate a certain amount of HP, and then after 4 seconds, you will lose a certain amount of HP per second. Her skill is fine, it has quite good skillings, and with her C4 you can sort of front load with it. It does really suck though that it seems to be mostly single target though, unlike Yolan. Moving on to her elemental burst, the cat girl throws down a cat in a hat. This cat acts like a taunt, which should be quite obvious. I would absolutely pummel the brakes off of anything that looked like that. During her burst, after the initial Anemo hit, you have 11 follow-up hits for the next 12 seconds. And when the cat is hit with an element, it will absorb this element and fire out a vivid shot with the element, which at C0 should be around 4 vivid shots over the entire burst. The thing about Lynette's burst absorption, which is quite interesting, is that one, for some reason, Lynette wanted to be extra special and has a different infusion priority from standard, with Cryo being at the top of the infusion priority, followed by the standard Pyro, Hydro, and Electro. To be fair, this honestly doesn't really matter that much because of the fact that it looks like Lynette's disgusting cat actually has to be hit with an attack to get the infusion, similar to Dendro MC's burst mechanics in a way, which is overall quite interesting. And her burst is going to be the most important part of her kit overall. It taunts, which can give her a synergy for some other characters. I'm hinting at Linny by the way, and it does deal the most damage in her kit. And with her vivid shots, I don't know how to feel about them. Compared to other absorptions like Kazuha or Sucrose's, at C0 it doesn't seem that every vivid arrow will apply that element. You would need her C2 for 4 elemental applications from this, which would be every vivid arrow wave, whatever you want to call it, since they'll be fired at pairs at C2. And like with her skill, it seems that her vivid arrows are also going to be very single target. With her basically being direct competition to Sucrose and Kazuha, her burst is basically just a downgraded version of both of them. Moving away from her burst, let's talk about her passives. Her Ascension 1 passive gives all party members an attack buff after you use her burst that goes up from 8% to 20% depending on how many different elements are in your team. Nothing really too complicated here. I do want to say that there is no heavy incentive to chase this attack buff. Just run her standard teams and see this as a bonus if anything. It isn't that impactful. And then Lynette's C4 is also quite straightforward. Her burst deals 15% more damage when it comes in contact with an element, which is something you're going to be doing regardless. Now to quickly go over Constellation, C1 offers some grouping after using her skill, but it's not that strong of a pull and only one instance, so it doesn't look that great, but just quality of life if anything. C2 allows her to get 8 vivid shots, which should guarantee you apply an element with every round of vivid shots, which is great for aggravate stuff. C3 buffs her burst, which is excellent as it's her biggest damage contributor. C4 gives you 2 charges of her skill, which is helpful for front loading damage and energy in your first rotation. C5 then buffs the skill, which is fine, whatever. And C6 gives you an Anemo infusion after using her skill for 6 seconds and buffs her Anemo damage by 20%. After C3, nothing really impacts her that much, and hell, C2 is a pretty good stopping point. And her earlier constellations are actually good enough to where I think getting at least C2 seems really necessary for her to feel complete. For weapons, just run Sac or Fav. She's an off-field damage dealer, I don't know what you expected. Without Sac or Fav, you're looking at around a 200 energy requirement, which can be lowered if you're using her as an on-field driver and aggravate, or if she's being used on a triple Anemo team. For her own personal damage though, if you care about that, Jade Cutter and Mistblur will be her best 5 stars. The usual. And then for 4 stars, the new Fontaine Craftable and Fishing reward are also going to be good for her. But generally, yeah, most of the time you're just going to be using her on Fav or Sac. Now for artifacts, again, I don't know what you expected. As an Anemo unit, there is really no reason not to use her on 4 Viridescent, unless you're using her as an off-field damage dealer in a Farzan carry team with Zhao or Wanderer, in which case you can either go with mix sets or just use the new Fontaine Crit artifact set. For main stats, because of how awkward her swirling seems with its limited range and no guarantee on grouping for 2 target swirls, unless you plan to do some funky EC or Hyperbloom stuff, ADC just seems to be her best build. Now for teams, this is where it gets kind of dicey, because if you wanted to use Lynette as a Viridescent slot, it's kind of just worse than using Kazuha or Sucrose, as you would lose out on their buffs and grouping, but she can be used there if you really want to. In terms of places where I can see Lynette shining, one thing could be on an Aggravate team, as an Onimo driver at C6. Her damage is quite solid on top of the fact that her burst Vivid shots will get a decent amount of Aggravates, and her burst itself will get around 5 swirls, so you can trigger Fishes A4 a lot. And then a team not relying on her C6 but instead relying on someone else's, being Farazan. She could be a good 3 Nemo flex slot, being hyper boosted by Farazan and Bennett, and she seems to have similar damage to Kazuha, so this doesn't seem like a bad idea. And lastly, she could enable Linny's best practical team, being Linny, Bennett, Zhangling, and Lynette. Kazuha is better here on paper due to the fact that you're basically solely relying on Linny's taunt, and there's a high chance you could just get ragdolled by any enemy when winding up your charge attacks on him. Lynette could alleviate this by having 2 taunts, and as we know, 2 is better than 1. So with 2 taunts, there's a potential that you don't get as big of a damage tank as just running a shielder, while also having decent enough mitigation through relying on the Beauty and the Beast taunts. But this again depends on how strong both of these taunts are together. If not, then the team probably isn't going to be that great. Another thing I can actually see is double Onimo teams. You can have Kazuha hold VV, and Lynette built on a damage build with a damage oriented set, and then Kazuha gives you a damage bonus and through VV reduces the resistance of the element that Lynette's Vivid Arrows will deal. One thing that kind of sucked about double Onimo is that both of the Onimo characters you were using usually were going to be AoE, so the team would fall off a lot in single target, but Lynette seems to be very single target oriented, so she could potentially alleviate this. Now for my thoughts on the Emo Cat, Lynette is given out for free, but until C2 and arguably C3, I don't think her damage output is worth justifying a team slot, and some of her more fun comps like being an Aggravate driver are tied behind getting her all the way to C6 for the Onimo infusion, but she's a 4-star and a new 4-star at that, so asking people to get 6 more copies of her for comps she isn't even best in slot in isn't good advice. Hell, I think Lynette's biggest value is just that she can free up an Onimo unit like Kazuha or Sucrose for another team. A lot of people were running ADC Kazuha in Wanderer teams with Farazan, and now they can just swap him out for Lynette and use Kazuha in elemental teams. She just kind of feels like Hazo with more off-field damage and a taunt. Speaking of taunt, her taunting capabilities are something we also need to see the effectiveness of to solidify her slot in a Linny team, which is what most people would want to be using. I don't really understand why they didn't give Linny and Lynette better synergy when they were literally marketed together, but whatever. So TLDR, Lynette is a solid off-field damage dealer and can be a decent driver at C6. But compared to already existing Onimo options, unless you are lacking one or just really like Lynette, it is quite hard to recommend her. The only saving grace I can see Lynette having is again how impactful are the Pneuma Osai mechanics. And even then, after a while we will be getting more and more Fontaine characters regardless, so she won't be that special for long. And on that note, thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment your thoughts on Lynette, as I'd love to hear and I respond to almost every single comment. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you guys on the flip side. Peace.